Thank you all for joining us on week 2 of the spring quarter, a very cold Chicago day. I'm Adam Gitacho. I'm teaching the political science and race, diaspora, and indigeneity. I'm also a fellow at the Chicago Center for Contemporary Theory, which is hosting this event. So I want to thank Anna Searle-Jones and Ryan for all their work to make this event happen. Thank you all again for being here. And it's a great, great, great pleasure to be in conversation with Jessica Swanston Baker. Jessica teaches ethnomusicology here at the music department. And we're here, of course, to discuss her wonderful, not so new anymore, but still excellent book, Island Times.
All right.
I didn't plan on doing this, but anyway, Island Times, Speed and the Archipelago from St. Kitts and Nevis. This is a book that I've heard about in formation for a number of years now. So it's just wonderful to be able to be in conversation about it and to see it here. Jessica is a scholar of the Caribbean. Her and I, a few years back, had a Neubauer project on thinking about Black citizenship in a global context, and she really brought to that very interdisciplinary group a deep interest in questions of cultural practice, performance, and sound. And I appreciated both in the book and both in that project and in this book the ways in which, even as a scholar of music, she's interested in kind of the sonic beyond music. So orality, everyday communicative practices, some of which will come up in the talk. She's also with our colleague Ryan Jobson, head of the Caribbean Studies Incubator on campus, and it's been such a wonderful space for bringing together young scholars across the university around Caribbean studies, and also creating a space for many graduate students who are interested in Caribbean studies. So I've been grateful for the scholarly spaces that Jessica has helped to make possible here. So the structure of this event is that I will pose a few questions to Jessica, and we'll be in conversation for the first part, and then we'll open it up to all of you for your questions. And then afterwards, we invite you to join us for a reception. Okay, so many of you as you were walking in, Jessica was playing from a playlist for us. So I hope you got to hear a little bit of the sounds. So could you just give us a sense? I thought it was important to start by listening to the sounds that are so central to the book. Could you give us a sense of just the genre of music we were listening to, what characterizes it, where it's from?
Yeah, so we were listening to wylers, or what some people in St. Kitts would just call soca, but that others would just refer to it as wylers. And this is carnival music. Carnival in St. Kitts and Nevis is a Christmas time event. So somewhere between like October and February, this is really the soundtrack of St. Kitts. It's typically pretty fast music, hovering maybe between like 165 and maybe like 180 at this point. It was 165 in the early 2010s, and at this point it's pushed much higher up in tempo. A lot of synthesized kind of, I don't know if you heard sounds, it sort of sounded like a steel pan or something, sort of kind of tinny. So this kind of juxtaposition of these high sounds with a lot of deep bass. I don't know that we got a ton of deep bass on this speaker, but if you can imagine a bass that's like really rattling your chest. And a lot of looping and repeating, chanting, the kind of music that you can learn immediately because they're saying the same thing over and over again in a way that really gathers meaning from the fact that it's happening repetitively. So I don't know if you got a full sense of that, because you have to imagine that this is happening loud. It's typically happening at like the wee hours of the morning. It's typically happening while you are also drinking a lot of rum. So absent of those things, it definitely takes on a different sound. But it's definitely wylers music from St. Kitts and Nevis.
Okay, so that's, of course, at the center of this book, Island Time. And I think one of the wonderful elements of the book, for those who haven't read it yet, and I hope everyone will, is the ways that you are always present in the book as author, as theorist, but also as participant in the jam sessions, concerts, Carnival Road marches that are the kind of stuff of your ethnographic research. And in fact, you begin with a personal and familial connection to this field of research. So as a way of kind of introducing us further to the topic, and could you share with us the ways in which your own family history intersects with the history of the musical traditions in St. Kitts and Nevis?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, there are quite a few intersections, and every time I tell this story, there's sort of like a different nuance to the narrative. So I'm kind of curious to see how I'll tell it today. But one important thread is that my paternal grandfather was part of an early Caribbean ethnomusicology recording project. So in 1962, Roger Abrams and Alan Lomax go to the Caribbean. They're invested in recording the sounds of the Caribbean archipelago in support of the Caribbean Federation as like a really new world-making political project, the idea that we might be able to have a Caribbean nation across these different islands. And one of the ways that Alan Lomax thought that he could support this national effort was by showing how similar these far-flung islands are, that, you know, that Jamaica in the north and Trinidad in the south, and these hundreds of miles in between, that there is a cultural similarity, and that we can hear that by recording music from these places. That kids in Curacao are singing the same songs that the kids in St. Croix are singing. That we have calypso traditions throughout, mumming traditions throughout, that we can see how colonization and different formations of creolization have created these various performance practices that have a real relation. And my grandfather was part of that. So when they were in Nevis in July of 1962, they asked a bunch of musicians to come to a place. And my grandpa showed up and sang 3 songs. And he died about a year after that, when my dad was 13. And in the kind of moving around that happens after, a loved one dies, all of his personal effects were lost. All of his songs, there are no other recordings. And in 2007 or 8, we received these Lomax recordings that nobody knew existed through a repatriation project. And it was from that moment that it became kind of my responsibility and my family to do something with these recordings. I think we know that after sort of a relational turn in the humanities and all of these ethical debates about what to do with the stuff that we collect as researchers, that there's always a kind of like latent thread that we're supposed to leave it for people's ancestors so they can do stuff with it. And so I'm the ancestor doing something with it. And that's what this book is really an attempt to take those recordings and to think from them. And I realized that really what I really needed was a context for them, that there weren't really any other books on music in St. Kitts and Nevis to think with, not a ton of history that moved beyond maybe like the 1880s, thinking about what's happening socially in St. Kitts and Nevis. And so I tried to use those recordings as a starting off point of making something, creating the context, but also doing that in a place where like my aunties live and my grandmother was, and that my field research was something that was really suffused with their desires for what a book is supposed to look like. Having to go to church on Sundays, even though, even if I was at a party until 5 a.m., it was important that I showed up in a particular way. So I would say that my family is all in and through this book in a way that's really kind of inextricable.
Yeah. I loved that story, and I was just telling Jessica this because one of the figures who records her grandfather, Roger Abrams, a folklorist, has shown up in my own work as a scholar of oratorical traditions around the Caribbean, and we were just sharing our kind of love for his 1970s book, The Caribbean Man of Words. But a kind of amazing thing about the book, for me, again, as a kind of social scientist, political theorist, is the ways in which you open up some familiar terrain, say the question of the project of West Indies Federation or the broader project of Caribbean independence and development, through the kind of registers of the sonic and the musical. So I wanted to think a little bit about that through the title of the book, Island Time. It's a concept that registers in many different ways throughout the book. And you invoke it early on as a way in which it becomes an important trope for selling the Caribbean and selling St. Kitts and Nevis in particular as a tourist destination. And you have this great line, which I love, on page 45, where you say, The paradox is that the island space that gestated the very capitalism from which islandness, that is, the island's slow insularity, was later imagined to provide respite. So what forms does this association of slowness and islandness take in St. Kitts and Nevis? And I think one kind of big theme across the book is about the place of St. Kitts and Nevis in the Caribbean. So to what extent are there things that are particular about St. Kitts and Nevis around sort of island time? To what extent is it kind of representative or emblematic of the Caribbean as a whole?
Yeah, well, so island time definitely refers to the more vernacular definition that we all know, thinking about sort of an aberrant, slow time, respite. But I think it also refers to other ways that people in St. Kitts and Nevis, or the island is imagined as being different because of its temporality. So, I mean, many of the ways that come up in the book are because of its speed. That people in St. Kitts and Nevis talk fast. That like how fast you move on the street is something that someone will adjudicate and say to you, even if they don't know you. If somebody is, being socially appropriate is whether you're being too fast. It's like, are you speaking in somebody else's business that you're not supposed to? So island time is the vernacular idea and the layering of all these other kind of temporalities instead. But in relation to the rest of the Caribbean, St. Kitts is just a small place. It's just a small island, especially as a quote unquote sovereign nation in the Caribbean. And so I think that for a long time it was imagined, even amongst these Caribbean places, as a particularly slow or behind. Not just slow because, things move slowly, and they certainly do. Paperwork is going to get lost. And the shop that said it was going to be open at 4 p.m. will not be open at 4 p.m. And we don't know when it will be open again. And that's sort of a regular experience, I think, of being in St. Kitts and Nevis. But certainly they're just an imagination of people from bigger islands, more wealthy islands for sure, islands that have more global visibility, that St. Kitts is, and Nevis, which is even smaller, are just behind. And so the question for me when I made Speed and Archipelago, I was obviously looking for a succinct title. I wanted something like flash and catchy, and instead of just these two kind of clunky theoretical ideas. But I really couldn't think of any other way to talk about the big umbrella term other than speed, because the way that I'm theorizing speed is from political theorists. I think you guys do a great job of thinking about speed and acceleration, is that speed is a deviation from a projected path. And that allows me to think about things like modernization and development and postcoloniality and sovereignty, instead of these kind of like specific events, as kind of inevitabilities in the Caribbean. And so then the way that different nations, like politically, or people's individual actors do things in a way to like mitigate the effects of these, knowing that they're inevitable, I think speed becomes a way of kind of encompassing these different kinds of moves. And also a way of talking about the music. The music is just fast. It's just fast music. And there's there's a through thread in the way that people are creating, the way that they're sounding and moving, and the way that they're thinking about themselves, like politically, within like a much larger global scale.
Yeah. So let's get to the music then. I mean, I think one of the things you mentioned in your discussion of island time is this sense of kind of belatedness or being behind on a projected timeline. Say, you mentioned St. Kitts is relatively late to gain independence, 1983.
Right.
But within this context of whatever developmental political belatedness emerges this sound that's incredibly fast, right? 165 to 180 beats per minute. So what facilitates the emergence of this new sound, kind of musically, technologically, culturally? Where does wylers come from?
I think that wylers comes from a desire to sound something new. That's what people were saying. That's what people are telling me. A lot of the songs in like the mid 90s and late 1990s, early 2000s were really about this idea of bringing something new. Like the cyclical the way that Carnival works is this recurrent event, right? It's going to come back every year, and it's going to be sort of the same thing. And so I feel like it's up to musicians and performers to inject newness into it. And so it's like, I know what I sounded like last year. This year I'm going to bring something new. And so I just imagine the music as this place where, if this idea of like things are the same, things keep happening, and in order to like make a splash or to feel a shock, I have to inject something new, that they sort of distilled that down, and that speed, tempo, becomes a really important, like salient, effective way of making people feel newness, experience newness through tempo. And especially because it also, when you're thinking about music, newness has to be something that's also within a context that is recognizable. You can't just come with, like now we use accordions and we like sing in papiamento. It has to be something that is relevant, that's rooted in sounds that are familiar to people. So yeah, speed becomes newness. And it takes on a different valence in the context of like the larger history of Caribbean music, because by the 1990s, different islands in the Caribbean have really staked ownership to different genres of the Caribbean. So if you think of the Caribbean, what's one genre that you might think of? Reggae. And who owns reggae?
The Jamaican is nodding.
Yes, my resident Jamaican is nodding, right? Jamaica owns reggae in a way, and kind of all of the politics that come with it. You might also think of calypso, and Trinidad owns calypso. They say they own it. It is an important part of their national like identity and product. In a Trinidadian university, they say that you study calypso because this is important to who we are as a nation. And part of that is also creating narratives that suggest that no other islands were part of this process, despite the fact that they're super close together, that other people were doing calypso around the same time. So the idea of speed, I think, for folks in St. Kitts and Nevis and in like the Leeward Archipelago, all of the tiny Eastern Caribbean islands, was to suggest that there was another way of like putting a stamp of ownership on a sound. So this is not the soca, and they're saying this is not your Trinidadian soca and calypso. This is our thing because it's very fast, and because our women can dance fast to it, and because we have a lot of energy, sort of creating these narratives around what it means to be Kittitian-Nevisian around this fast music. And something that I think is really interesting, and I don't get into it a ton, I try to bring it in the fourth chapter, is that in like a larger context, I think, of like Black music, where Black sounds are being appropriated by non-Black people, and they're finding ways of like codifying Black sound in a way that like non-Black people can do it. I find that Black musicians, if I'm thinking about bebop, I'm thinking about Little Richard, they go faster. They're like, oh, you think you can do this, but you can't do it like me. Mm-hmm. And they're able to, I think, to make that claim by a sort of performance of virtuosity, where speed is a really big part of that. And so I want to kind of read Kittitians-Nevisians as doing the same thing. If Carnival in Trinidad is about being up all night and you think you can drink rum and you think you can dance longer and harder, I'll show you that actually in the small islands we can do it even better as a part of our identity. And then they've just run with that ever since, and continuing to have speed be just super central to the idea of the place.
Okay, yeah, that's really helpful, and I hadn't really, I think, clocked the ways in which it speaks to a larger practice of using speed to kind of outsmart, outmaneuver. Yeah. So I wanted to ask next, I guess, about the contestation around this new sound. And there are two interlocutors in the book that I'd like to foreground. So one is Uncle Irving, who describes this wyler sound as, quote, almost like a U-turn to a more African-oriented music. So the new music, which for Uncle Irving also, he explicitly says there's a generational gap, right, between the kind of young folks who are doing Wyler's music and his own generation. But there's a suggestion that it's not following a kind of developmental telos.
Right.
Then there's another figure, Mention, who's the lead singer of the New Vibes Band, one of the kind of Wyler groups you look at, who says basically, we've always been fast. Mm-hmm. Like, that's the thing we do in the Eastern Caribbean. And he links kind of, even if it's new, it's kind of for him linked to a longer history of musical practice in St. Kitts. So where he says we've always been faster than the other islands. So I wanted to ask about like what's at stake for these two figures and the wider debate about where, what's at stake for in these competing accounts for your interlocutors, for you, for the kind of, how we understand the place of the wylers.
Yeah, I think it's about historical legitimacy, that there's just, I think so much of what has to happen in the context of like an inevitable development in the Caribbean is like, a negotiation of how we're going to think about how our past relates to who we are now. And I think there may be two different generations, two generational camps about how that has to happen. We have those who are invested in a kind of folkloric blackness as the avenue forward, which I think Jamaica would be a great example of that, but Puerto Rico, reggaeton, right? If you have you have poor Black people making music that is once denigrated, and then you realize that it can be useful to the state in some way, that a political party can get elected because they have the hottest band playing a song for them, et cetera, et cetera. Then you start to create and spin narratives that suggest that they, are a part of some type of national past. And then I think you have a generational camp, on the other hand, that is just really trying to reject that development kind of teleology altogether. And they're just suggesting that there's just kind of a through thread that always has been. I wonder, I'm not exactly sure what's at stake in terms of like a particular kind of national history. But it does seem to me that the legitimacy of the music, that there's something for contemporary wylers musicians that they don't want the legitimacy of the music to be hinged on the kind of folkloric Blackness idea. They want it to be hinged on this idea that they were always modern, kind of like a future forward-facing kind of futurist argument about the idea that we've always been this way, not that we have to sort of rediscover our African roots in some way. And also importantly, not wanting to think about Africa necessarily as the only origin for the kind of stuff that they're doing, which is useful, I think, for one generation, and for another it feels like it's kind of diverting the potency of who they are as a people to an elsewhere, and wanting to really think about the island space as generating something useful for them.
Yeah. I mean, the generational point, of course, also hinges on the kind of political transformation that's happening, right? The transition from the kind of statehood to independence moment, of which kind of Uncle Irving's generation is representative, the wylers moment that represents a kind of the post-independence moment of post-83. So I wonder also about, I'm of course preoccupied with the U-shaped back to Africa point, like about, in some ways I think there are all these anxieties that are being described and discussed through the music about where the nation is, what the post-independence moment has brought or not brought. And I wonder how those kind of anxieties or potentialities or possibilities are being kind of talked about through the music, or through these kind of debates about, wylers music.
Yeah, for sure. I think you've hit the nail on the head, that there are a lot of anxieties about, I guess, what development can actually bring. I think one of the things about the Caribbean as an archipelago is that you're also seeing how it's going elsewhere, and that development perhaps, is not shelling out on its promises in other places in the Caribbean. So, I think these anxieties about speed in general, about the idea that there is a projected path and that development is part of it, and and neoliberalism and globalization and other kinds of general vectors, that they're inevitable, and that speed becomes about mitigating their effects. That your kind of slowing down and speeding up becomes in a way, your only way of navigating something that feels like it's kind of running on without you becomes sort of a rhythmic play, as opposed to deciding whether or not it will happen or not. It is a given, and how can we move within this kind of flow of things? I know that you're into the U-turn. I think that, so in the conversation with Uncle Irving, I feel like he comes to the U-turn because he realizes how badly he's talking about the contemporary music, and he's a musician. And so the U-turn is about saying, well, I mean, maybe it's not so bad because it's going back to Africa, but that becomes a justification. If you can say it's back to Africa, then it kind of justifies all of your feelings about it as primitive, as underdeveloped, et cetera, and then you can still relegate it to a pastness that keeps the future open for like better music that he hopes is coming.
Yeah.
So yeah, the U-turn is, I think it's like a cognitive dissonance. He's trying to just come up with a narrative for how to place this music so that it doesn't make him feel bad about the contemporary generation. And I respect that. I think that's what we're all doing, really, of like sort of these like history making projects. We're just kind of telling narratives that help us feel like we can understand where we're going, and that like the possibilities that we want are still possible.
I mean, another set of descriptions that emerge, again, I think they seem quite generationally different or specific. One is the sense that it's modern music, but not developmental, right? And so for again, there's a way in which we assume those to coincide, right? Modernity and development or progress are supposed to go together. So this kind of disjuncture that something could be modern but not actually developmental. And the second one that I'm not sure is related, but it goes back to your kind of earlier point about virtuosity, that a number of the older musicians you talk to say, well, they don't really know how to play music. They're not trained. There's a certain sense of kind of haven't been appropriately educated, or a kind of educative, or another kind of developmental story. So I just wondered if you might say something about what it means to say something could be modern but hasn't developed. What makes it modern for these figures, and what makes it undevelopmental? Right.
I mean, it's modern because it's now, because it's contemporary. So we have to just sort of acknowledge, the moment that it's in. But I think like the critique about wylers is really a critique about the state. It's like, I'm getting this from people who are wanting to talk about how the state is underdeveloped and how the government has failed them, and how no one has poured into the arts, and how like the education is crumbling and failing, and how the prime minister is a crook, right? I think wylers becomes, I don't know what's the word, like a talisman, or like what's like, not a straw man, something that you hold up to like talk with, like you're talking about this, but it's really you're talking about something else. Emblem. And an emblem for other kinds of failures of development in the contemporary moment. And so then you're able to say like the youth don't have jobs, and that's why they're in this whole, that's why this music sounds still terrible. So I actually think that in the Caribbean, I imagine in most of the postcolonial world, that there's a real difference between modern and development is a kind of given. That development is its own metric. That's now we're thinking about like the IMF and like GDPs and certain kinds of like literacy rates, that we know that even as time keeps going, and we have to, and as like tourism schemes have to keep going, and other kinds of modernization have to keep happening, that like the real development is something that feels super stalled.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it also just suggests that there is a kind of set of imaginaries about development that were, homegrown, I guess is the wrong word, but imagined a kind of national project of development that didn't imagine its telos was already decided by other places, other societies, if you know what I mean. So that something about development was supposed to happen on St. Kitts's terms, and it hasn't happened. Things are happening, things are changing, but it's not on the kind of terms of a kind of nationalist settlement. So I don't know, it just seemed like that was partly what's at stake in the kind of difference between something, the real transformation that people are trying to make sense of, not just the political transformation, but kind of the cultural transformation, but that it's happening there's a disjuncture between what you thought that process was going to yield and what it actually has yielded in the islands.
Yeah, or at least what you wanted it to, even if you knew it wasn't ever going to yield that you still retain the right to critique that. And talking about what you hoped it would be and what it isn't, it's just like a really like fertile space.
So this, I think leads to a kind of another question about how a specific site in which these anxieties about development, modernity are being staked out, and this is kind of on women's bodies. And here what I found particularly interesting is this kind of the sense that there's both a way in which the kind of moral degradation, degeneracy, all these terms are associated both with a kind of possibility of foreign contagion, that there's this kind of outsider influence that's shaping the nation, and a sense in which this is already endemic or a kind of process of internal corruption. And so you have this really wonderful chapter that reads the performance of Tashima Brown, who is competing in the National Carnival Queen pageant in 2014-2015. And this is, she gives a kind of monologue where, for those who haven't read the book yet, she plays the figure of an older woman critiquing younger women for the ways that they're sort of fallen prey to the contagion of this new music. Right. So I wonder if you could speak to us about this particular performance and the ways it kind of speaks to a wider anxiety about the policing of women's bodies. I mean, what I found particularly striking about the performance was that the way it stages this critique of younger women in the voice of an older woman. So it's a kind of intro women, it's like women critiquing women, women policing women, rather than say kind of, men. But also, this is a place where you talk about how the kind of performance that she engages on the stage, the ways it actually mirrors and echoes everyday communicative practices. So you sort of blur the boundaries or help us bridge the boundaries between kind of staged performance and kind of everyday communication. So I wonder if you could help us think about those.
Yeah, so Tashima Brown, I wish I could show this performance. Pretty much she does, like in the Carnival Queen pageant, her talent is to do a monologue where she pretends to be an old woman talking about young women whose bodies are being ravaged by this very fast music. And she references speed in all of these different registers. She's talking about the fast women, but she's also saying that, people who think they're better than everyone are also the people who walk fast through the bank and act like they don't know anybody else. And she talks about how fast music is something that can infect you and give you a heart attack, and chikungunya, which was a disease in the early 2010s that was mosquito-borne and moving throughout tropical places in the southern hemisphere. So just the idea that all of these kinds of discourses, obviously they're really performative and sort of dramatic and hilarious, that these discourses play out on women's bodies, I think, is just a way that it also happens within the broader nation, that the health of the nation is imagined by whether or not mothers are taking care of their children. Or I should say the flip side, if there are, anything bad happening in the country, if the youth seem out of control, unemployment, that instead of thinking specifically about like political policies, it'll be about how mothers are not taking care of their children, how they're not beating them enough, how they're not taking them to church enough, how they don't care. And so the music ends up being another great foil for all of this, where the suggestion is that the music is what is infecting people, taking them away from what's important and what really matters. And that specifically it's the speed, it's a speed that's beyond ration. It's a speed that's beyond, like sound decision making, a speed that is just on impulse. the idea that this plays out for women is, I think, interesting because it gets me to this idea of omanship, or the idea that, you know, women are teaching each other that this is how people will think about you. So how it is that you move as a woman, how you understand yourself as a girl child and a woman is dependent on being really fluent, dexterous in these kinds of temporal regimes, where how fast your body moves or how slow it moves, it will say a lot about you in a particular kind of social context. And this, obviously, this speaks to so much like larger, you know, Caribbean music performance work. I'm thinking about Carolyn Cooper's stuff on Noises in the Blood, the idea that a Black woman's butt and how she moves it is a real source of power and like potential political potency. So I don't read that far into it because I'm really trying to just talk about sort of the speed of a woman's body. But sure, it participates in just all of these bigger narratives about the role that women's bodies play in, you know, like projecting something about the nation.
Yeah. Okay, great. I think I'll just ask one more question and then we can open it up. And maybe this is just to invite you to say something about the archipelagic that's also in the title of the book. So before we started, Jessica was telling me how difficult it is to write a book where there is no archive and where your interlocutors don't want to speak to you or refuse to speak to you. And one of the last chapter of the book, which is, I think, my favorite chapter, turns to these kind of online forums and where people are having a kind of regional conversation about music, making claims for either nationalist readings of the origins of music, disrupting those kinds of narratives, sharing music. You find some of your own clips there. And you describe this as a form of archipelagic listening. So can you just give us a sense of both these forums and spaces for discovering, contesting, and reimagining the history of the regional music and how they came to be a kind of source for your own work and thinking?
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, where most of what we have, I think, for Caribbean history does come out of very specific national archives with a real focused on one particular nation. People in smaller islands just found it really hard, impossible to find anything about the history of their music. And even as you could hear the relationship between your music in St. Kitts or Nevis or Antigua or Anguilla, in the larger mainstream flows of music, there are no narratives that were suggesting that your hearing was correct. And so then the only thing that could come of that is that, you know, these great islands had this amazing music and that we heard it and in St. Kitts and Nevis, and then we just started imitating it, which is like, you know, it's kind of a hard narrative to believe about yourself, I think, as a people. And so in the late 1990s, but really like I think around 2000 is when we start to have a lot of online forums in the Circum-Caribbean where people are finally uploading what they have to like bulk share websites and then YouTube. I don't remember what year YouTube started. Paula? Okay, so by 2005, Paula Harper, everybody. In 2005, so in the early 2000s, by 2005, we have people who are like bulk uploading all of these records that they have to YouTube. And it's the first time really that there is, I think, a distinctive and sustained conversation with actual evidence about how Caribbean musics, especially small islands, relate to a larger thrust. And it also means that they can hear it and also debate. These forums are wild. People are staking their entire livelihoods on being online all the time. And I mean, I guess this is right. The people, they're chronically online, being online all the time to talk about how it is that their national music relates to a larger thrust. And this is the only real archive that I know of. Changes in YouTube recently that have made it so based on an algorithm and like telling you what to go to next have made it harder to use it in the way that I was able to in like 2013. But for sure, this remains the most, I think, productive and full archive of like pan-Caribbean music that exists. And so archipelagic listening comes out of not only these forums and these like uploads from YouTube, but also now we have a proliferation of online streaming radio stations that are committed to making sure they're doing like a very capacious and meticulous overview of music of all islands of the Caribbean. It's like on Monday we're listening to these 7 islands, on Tuesday we're doing this, and people were just online, just making these connections, talking about this one rhythm or this one song in this obscure place that relates. And so through that, they also have these reimagining of the big narratives of Caribbean music. I have in the book where my Uncle Irvin is like, yeah, I met Bob Marley, and I met him right before he wrote punky reggae. Like this idea that these chance encounters could potentially have had some impact on these bigger ideas. So the person who invented soca music, he goes to Dominica and some of the French islands before he writes one of his big songs. And this one fact, that one guy saw him in the Dominica airport, becomes like really, it sort of spins all of these narratives about then we're able to hear differently his music. If we can believe that he was in the French Caribbean, and if we can just assume that it might have had some effect on him, then we listen differently to the music that we were once only able to think of in the context of Trinidad. And so I think of archipelagic listening as a really practically about listening literally to the islands across the archipelago, but also about a different kind of imagination of thinking across scales and sort of against official narratives to connect dots that you know to be connected but have no real evidence for.
Yeah. I mean, it's a wonderful way to close also, because I think it's a model for Caribbean studies more generally. Like, it's a way to understand and listen to music, as you've said, but it's also a way to think about how we would tell different social and political histories of the region. And there's many other suggestions of the book about all these kind of fascinating connections. Like earlier, we didn't even talk about this, about Garvey's appearance in St. Kitts and so forth. So it just provides, I think, an opportunity to think beyond the kind of, or speak to the ways in which the region is connected across hierarchies, across scales, and spaces. So I think it's just recommend it as a kind of method more broadly.
Thank you.
So, okay, with that, I think we can open it up for Q&A from the audience.
Oh, we have Andrew over here. Oh, wait for the mic.
Yeah.
So this is for recording now for
I see.
Adam, you mentioned that Jessica said that when you were doing the research for this project that people didn't want to talk to you. And why is that?
Shocking.
Honestly, I think it's because I was a young woman. I was 22. I think that was a big part of it, honestly. That it's not that they didn't want to talk to me at all. They didn't want to talk to me about the questions that I had or about, technical questions. I think that a lot of times my questions were read in, that felt like I was interrogating, that I was quizzing about history, and I think people felt pretty sensitive to that. But I also, in the book I talk about one of the very first interview I have is the actual Minister of Culture telling me, we don't really have anything here, and that was a huge anxiety for my family before I was going. And so I really believe that was also part of it. If you are consistently made to believe that there is nothing of note happening on your island, that the music you make is stupid, and that in fact it is just a terrible copy of other better music elsewhere, that I think a researcher coming to you and wanting to hear you talk about it, I think there's just an anxiety around that, and it's unclear really what to say. So people would point me to other kinds of music. They would show me somebody was showing me their Beatles albums, wanting to let me know that I know real music, but just not invested really in thinking about St. Kitts and Nevis specifically. Yeah.
Thank you so much for this rich conversation. My question is really about the circulation of wylers, because I was listening to you talk and I realized that in Jamaica wylers is not really a thing. No. Why is that?
Because
And the why is that is not it's not me doing the arrogant Jamaican thing that the Caribbean needs to revolve around Jamaica. It's actually a question about what are the particular kind of sites or circuits of circulation, and what do they mean for how we understand Caribbean listening and Caribbean music? You know what I'm saying?
Of course. Yeah, so I do think that, so the critique, at least what wylers musicians are telling me, is that they tell them that it's too fast, that they just can't get into it. We can't move for it. It doesn't jive with our vocabulary of moving. It's just, it's not getting us where we need to go in terms of like a party context. So the circulation of wylers is really in these global carnivals. So firstly, I think it circulates in a kind of relatively unfettered way, and I say unfettered meaning that in a way that's like well received and understood, like it seems like in a home context around the Leeward Islands, smaller islands where their own island traditions, like in the US Virgin Islands with jam band, in Antigua with like burning flames and this like iron band, rhythm band stuff, that their local context would already be able to accommodate music that sounds like wylers. But then more further aflung, I think it's where we have carnival contexts, where if any place that has a juve, talking early morning, you know, this revelry, that you will hear it in those contexts at the height of it, because those sort of long, you know, carnival where it's about like a slow ramp up and then you want a real apex, then wylers comes really quite in handy for jamming. But Jamaican, but I do think there is like a nationalist also, like,
Or arrogance knows no bounds.
Okay, yes. Yeah, I do think that is actually part of it, like the idea that these small islands, down islands, right? You guys don't matter, you know, and therefore we will not listen to you because you should be listening to us. Yeah.
Sounds right.
Yeah, okay. That's my reading. Yeah, thank you for your question. Yeah.
So this is a question about archipelagic listening.
Yeah.
So obviously through the talk, you started a little bit with federation and then its failure, and then obviously all of these different musical forms having a kind of national attachment to them. So there's a way in which one could think of archipelagic listening as an attempt to recover a kind of federative vision, the idea of a kind of interconnection that can, again, be the ground of politics, but one could also imagine it being the opposite of that. That is to say, by recognizing the connection, one recognizes the death of that vision, and that opens up a possibility for other ways of thinking about either coexistence or not.
Yeah.
And I just wonder if you could say a little bit more about which of those, if either, you think archipelagic listening could enable or should enable, or what are its possibilities and what are the limits of its possibilities?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I definitely think there is a possibility, or I'm hopeful, and I think that at least the people in St. Kitts who I talk to who are interested in like thinking through the ideas are also hopeful about the possibilities of an archipelagic vision of, if not a nation, some type of coalition, of a kind of consciousness and solidarity that's based on recognizing the kind of contemporary sameness. And I think that archipelagic listening, where it might lead or might like gesture toward Caribbean performance as also being a site for like a political power or some type of potency, is also, I think that people in the Caribbean would be behind that, that there's a lot of possibility there. But I feel like, I can't think of a great example of how this is in action. I can think of places where I want to think from, like, Ryan Jobson was in our class. We have a class on Caribbean precarity, and we were talking about like figures like the Mighty Sparrow as like a great calypsonian that everyone in the Caribbean feels belongs to them and is able to really capture something very general and quite specific about Caribbeanity that I think has like a lot of potential, not only because it puts a lot of power and knowing into one individual, which I think can be useful for like mobilizing people in one particular way. I've also had, going back to Danielle's question when she, the answer about like carnival as this also kind of like powerful space, the idea that there is music or that there's a kind of archipelagic listening that galvanizes a bunch of people around a music that's meant to just make you kind of gather together and move as one. I think there's a lot of kind of potential there for a form of archipelagic listening. But I do my best not to kind of over promise on it. I do think of it, like Adam said, as a kind of model for how we might read certain situations of like listening broadly, of folks imagining coalition sonically. But I kind of feel like I want to leave it there because I don't have a great example of like how it moves beyond that.
Yeah, I mean, it also seems like failures are part of it. Like the exchange you just had with Danielle about, well, why aren't wylers listened to? Like it's a model that accommodates both this kind of potentiality for identifying a contemporary sameness, but also the forums and this exchange is also about the moment in which actually that fails to appear, right? Like where someone insists, no, this is actually Trinidadian, it's not yours, or like we can't listen to it because it's too fast for us,
right,
or whatever.
and as a productive,
Yeah. And that part of it seems as productive as the kind of possibilities for solidarity and commonality.
Yeah, because it forces a kind of creativity and a conversation that otherwise just isn't happening. So even that, like listening to someone tell you that you're wrong is also part of a kind of archipelagic listening. Someone listening to you say, no, these are the same, and saying, absolutely not, this has nothing to do with it, and sort of charting another way is also, I think, a kind of listening beyond that I think can be really generative. Thank you for the question.
Hello. I also have a question about archipelagic listening. If my interpretation is correct, archipelagic listening is operative not only at the level of hearing to get a sense of sound and meaning, but also the listening is a practice of attempting to experience space and time as a way that those who inhabit the archipelago are experiencing? Okay. If so, I'm curious to then know how your own deployment of archipelagic listening has influenced your identity and your potential relationship with your grandfather.
That's such a beautiful question. It is the connection. I mean, I think that my ability to try to amass an archive of things and objects and come at this sort of real behind and under, I think of that very much as a form of archipelagic listening. And I recognize that really stretches the metaphor in a way that maybe it becomes not super useful, but the idea that to be able to think across things like a painting and then like talking to my uncle one time, you know, and then like an album that someone gives me, but there's a wrong CD inside, and then that CD is actually of something else. Like that was kind of all I had to go on. And so it does make me feel like the connections between things that perhaps never actually touch and don't really meet is something that can still be like super meaningful, is one that certainly makes me feel much closer to my grandfather or to some idea of like legacy or rootedness that had felt really absent before that. And I think that that was my task. If we can think of all families, I don't know, I don't know if I can say all families, but kind of, I imagine that all families are sort of searching for this idea of how it is that we can make our lives feel meaningful and to stretch beyond the time that we actually have here. That, I mean, I think music is super useful for that, for like rehearsing kinds of stories and narratives and imagining like a long thread of history. But this project also, yeah, kind of archipelagic listening between things has done a lot of similar kind of work. Thank you for that question, Nina.
Yeah, this is maybe not the beautiful question, but it but it is one that I think brings together a few of the things that you've talked about today. And I'm wondering, thinking about archipelagic listening, because it's just such a rich concept, what you can tell us, in addition to what you already have in the book, about the way that it develops and changes as media of circulation change, overlap, shift, disappear, and also what it has to do with sounds that aren't musical.
That's a good question too. Well, one thing that I like about the Archipelago as a model is that it isn't taken for granted. Like, what is in the archipelago gets to shift every time. And we can see some of that in like sort of the political configurations of the Caribbean, like who's tied to who's like colonially administrated, right? St. Kitts and Nevis was first St. Kitts, Nevis, and Anguilla, even though Anguilla is pretty far flung geographically. And so I think that archipelagic listening, you know, is something that allows us to just think about like networks of listening that obviously have to change over time as like it gets easier to move between spaces, as if archipelagic listening is something that's happening in the immediate post-emancipation, this is something that's happening between places with booming sugar plantations. This is happening now between like St. Kitts and Dominican Republic and Trinidad, which is different when we have in the 1980s CARICOM, which is a political, what do you call it? Like a coalition where now people are able to move freely between some of the Caribbean islands without like a visa, and now we have like a common currency. So music and people, actual musicians, move differently during this time. But then obviously as we have things like the internet, you know, there's a different kind of understanding of where the Caribbean is. We can imagine like the metropolitan spaces. We can really imagine metropolitan France as a real Caribbean hub. New York has always been a Caribbean place, but there's a kind of like mobility between St. Kitts and Nevis and these other places that allows it, I think, to congeal as now part of the archipelago and the listening space kind of differently. But I think going back to my first point about the archipelago being different like every time, everybody's archipelago is different, is a really kind of important one, because it's important for me to make the point that archipelagic listening is not, I mean, it is kind of a fantasy idea, but it's not the suggestion that everyone everywhere is listening to all the things and music is just like this universally free flowing, you know, which is like super beautiful idea, but it's just not true, right? People in Jamaica are not listening to what's happening in St. Kitts and Nevis, realistically. But like when I talk about champeta in the book, thinking about Colombia, like our ability in the Colombian national context to understand champeta as it's like to become legible as a kind of music is dependent on our ability to hear it like in tandem with music from St. Kitts and Nevis, with music from the British Virgin Islands and US Virgin Islands. And that is also a kind of archipelagic listening, certainly for commercial gain, right? Again, archipelagic listening is not a kind of utopic, idea, but it is something that happens differently in different kinds of spaces, for sure. That's sort of a long-winded answer. I feel like there was a really good question in there. Okay, great, okay, thank you, Travis.
I feel like I want to continue this thread, which is I want to ask you about a different part of the subtitle, which is that you have an unusual construction. This is a book not in St. Kitts and Nevis, but from St. Kitts and Nevis. So one, that's to say that I'm wondering what it means to write from the place of the so-called Lesser Antilles, right? I'm just saying, because I feel like this is important, because Jessica's always talking about size.
I
right?
am
like
always talking about that.
The smallest places. And also the fact that archipelagic listening cuts across some of these arbitrary linguistic boundaries as well, that, in some ways, I don't want you to give up in some ways on the utopic vision that archipelagic listening represents, because it's actually a lot more expansive than the model of federation that circulated originally in the 1960s, that to listen from St. Kitts is also to engage Saba and the Dutch Caribbean, it's to engage Guadeloupe, it's to engage Puerto Rico. So I really was wondering sort of, one, is your desire to get us out of these not just nationalistic historiographies, but also linguistic historiographies? And then also it just alerts us to different modes of listening that now seem to proliferate, like alongside YouTube or TikTok. Because it's true that Jamaicans don't really listen to, or only uptown people listen to soca, but the fact that now there are these dance hall genres that you flag in the book, so like they are listening to Byron Messiah, who's from St. Kitts, or is born in Jamaica, but is from St. Kitts.
Right.
So it opens up all these new pathways of articulating an awareness of a place like St. Kitts that's happening distinctly through music. Right?
Yeah.
It's not happening through kind of stilted political forms like CARICOM. It's actually happening a lot more through TikTok and music. So I was just wondering, sort of again, what does it mean to theorize from St. Kitts? What was the choice for that title?
Yeah.
Or perhaps there actually is this more expansive political vision still.
I love that. Yeah, I would love for there to be a potential political vision from that. And I forgot about, dance hall and Byron Messiah is also being, kind of a speaking back. I now just forgot the questions.
From St. Kitts.
Oh, right, yes, okay. So, well, because I felt like I could not write about St. Kitts. I felt that my ability to really write about the music, to talk about the sound, because it was predicated on such an expansive practice of listening, and really specific practices of like iteration, of joking, of a play on an idea, that it wasn't so much me, I wasn't feeling like the ethnomusicologist being like, this is the music of St. Kitts and Nevis, that in fact, but what I was trying to do was theorize from a place, was theorize with people who are already theorizing about themselves from a place, meaning like from the vantage point, from the accent, from the sounds, from the locations, which feels like a kind of a different kind of project. And so, definitely now, so then I'm what does it mean to think and theorize from a small place, in an archipelago of small places, which definitely has a lot to do with, I think, the psyche of people, how they think and write and talk about themselves and each other. And that was what I was trying to get at. And so it felt more honest to talk about being from St. Kitts, which is also something that I also grapple with. Like, can I be from St. Kitts? It's easy to say that as a child in the house with my parents with their incredibly thick accents, and everyone around me growing up in the Bronx is from the Caribbean. I had an accent until I was until I went to school at like 6 or 7, to imagine myself as being from this place, a place that we call home. And now to really grapple with what it means to be from a place that I don't live in as an adult. And that the project of this book is about kind of tethering those roots in a different kind of way and reimagining them as real. And so the fromness it's a really kind of fraught concept that felt like the most honest way of talking about what the book is doing. Yeah.
I wanted to go back to Travis's question, because I don't know if you answered the second part of it, which is
I knew
about
it.
non-music
Okay.
sound.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, okay, so this maybe goes back to Adam's question about Tashima Brown and how the Queen show, how her monologue is to me also the way that people are performing. It's just a super expressive place. I mean, me and my cousins always say people in St. Kitts are mean. And when we say that, it's because someone is gonna say the thing. There is no elephant in the room, I feel like, in my experience. If one of your legs is longer than the other, someone is going to name that in the line at the grocery store. And how funnily and with the kind of pizzazz and flourish and performativity they gonna do that with is so that the other people laugh. And that is just my experience everywhere. And so the idea that we have to think about how people talk, what people are saying, how they talk, the inflection, the timing of it, is just, I feel like that is the real archive of the way that people are theorizing this place. And the fact also that wylers music, something that maybe I did say, I'm not sure, or didn't, is that a lot of the music is taking from music elsewhere. So whatever the hot song is on the top 40 charts, wherever, in the US or in the UK, we're gonna get some snippet of that. Not a direct remake, just taking it and somehow flipping it so that it is probably very sexual, even if that was not the original intention. And just kind of like distilling whatever's the catchiest part of it, distilling it down and making that now kind of the basis of the entire thing. And so sound, like music and sound, are such just kind of like a fluid continuum in the way that folks are thinking about, I think, what is the material for creativity. And that is terrifying and hard, right? In the book, I talk about just sexual innuendo all the time. Like I can't say anything without someone turning it into a song about how I want to have sex with them, or how about we did have sex, people I've never met before. Like this is so like, and then drumming a beat on a table, like these ideas that like everything is material for a certain kind of creativity, particular creativity that is supposed to create something that feels new as shocking, new as a deviation from a path, just feels so central to the way that things are in those islands. Thank you.
Any last questions? Okay, well, if not, I think we have wine and snacks, and we just want to thank Jessica for...
Yeah, thank you guys for coming.